Hello, everyone. Dr. Eames here. What I'd like to talk to you about this time are theories about the nonprofit sector and nonprofit organizations in general. The first thing to really mention about this is that when you look at nonprofits, that it's a very interdisciplinary study. Research cuts across all the different dimensions that are out there. And I'm just going to look at a few of them and talk about some of the contributions and different perspectives that we have. Um, these theories have been proposed by a variety of different sources: sociologists, economists, historians, political scientists, psychologists, and anthropologists, and so forth, and just scholars in general. And this body of research is certainly increasing all the time. So let me just talk in general terms about these different perspectives and just narrow it down to, in particular, the four that you see here. When we use history as a perspective and a source of theory to understand nonprofit sector and nonprofit organizations, um, we have to understand that we're getting a certain perspective and that the historical perspective is just a tool to understand something from a certain viewpoint, just like it would be from sociologists or political scientists or economists. So when we talk about historical contributions to understanding nonprofit sector, the biggest thing we take away is that there are historical forces that parallel the development of nonprofit organizations and their modification and changes over time. One of these central themes, for instance, was that citizens were extremely mistrustful of government. And because of this, um, government was not really allowed to try and attempt to solve society's problems. And what we got was, out of the historical Judeo-Christian tradition in particular, the idea of volunteering. And so many services in the early life of America were voluntary organizations, things that government did not do. And they certainly weren't profit making. So fire departments, libraries, schools, hospitals, and things like that were often where we saw the earliest nonprofits taking form. And so religion certainly was a motive and one of the primary motives in early times for this volunteering and helping. But as the nation changed over time, the needs for nonprofits certainly became more apparent. And the attitudes of the public in general had not changed much when it came to being mistrustful of government and letting government take over and do everything. And so people in general responded to the needs of the day in the ways that they were able to. And we had nonprofits grow and change over time in that sense. Sociologists contributed to us a different sort of perspective on understanding nonprofits in the sector. It was for the sociologist, it was all about how people are acting in groups and how this group interaction is really the motivating factor for many in the nonprofit sector. The idea that they can work together as a community to solve mutually agreed upon problems and so forth. And so from this perspective, sociologists are examining how people become socialized in this different sector and how this would relate to the development of things like human capital and social capital. So sociological theories on the nonprofit sector generally are focusing more or less on these sorts of issues, particularly on the role of community networks and so forth. And these networks are composed of individuals and groups and organizations who hold similar values and ideas. Now, when we look at it from the point of view of political scientists, they've contributed a completely different way of looking at the nonprofit sector and trying to understand it. One of the things that they pointed out was that it is all about accommodating diversity. Since it is government's obligation to treat all citizens equally, then nonprofit organizations are providing really a voice and services in those areas that the government does not address. Um, And there is some room for experimentation here. It is social experimentation. Nonprofits have a little bit greater freedom to begin, like, say, a new program to address a common social problem on a smaller scale than government would generally be able to do. Um, and government would have to use public funds to undertake some of these sorts of things. And uh, generally, the public doesn't support that. It also provides a way for the government to avoid increasing its own sense of bureaucracy. Everything moves slowly through the government because of bureaucracy and the layers of approval and so forth that have to be gone through. While nonprofits aren't hampered by that, they can respond quickly to social needs, and they can start up when they're needed and go away when they're not, and so forth, much more quickly and efficiently than government. So we've noticed that from the political scientists pointing out these issues, particularly when accommodating diversity, that there is more attention to minority needs from the nonprofit sector than government is able to do. And so that is their contribution. And what we do with these different perspectives is we combine them and use them to understand things in a more total way. So we look at what the economists have given us. They are completely sort of differently focused on what it means to be a voluntary sector, a nonprofit sector. And so we have a lot of contributions to our theories of understanding nonprofits from the economists, especially a lot of this terminology. So we have private goods, for instance. The person who pays gains the full benefit of some good or service, and the market determines what goods are produced and who consumes them. So that's what private goods are. You pay for something, you get the benefit of them. This is different from, say, a public good. A public good is something that everyone can have or participate in. It's public. And so this is often something that's provided by the government. So we pay taxes to make sure that these public goods that we all need are provided. Um, at the same time that these forces are in play, we also have the development of something called free riders. And these are individuals who benefit from the private and the public goods, but who don't pay and don't produce any effort in producing the benefits of these things. So these are basically people who are flying on the coattails of society. And then when we talk about these sorts of things, private, public goods, free riders, we really have to understand what an externality is. And an externality is just something that every individual does. We do things like we consume products and services. That's an externality. It's a reflection of our behavior. And our consumption is what I'm really getting at, affects other people. And it affects other people either negatively or positively or maybe neutrally, but there is generally a little bit of an effect there. So economists point out to us that there are those individuals in our society who attempt to benefit from the externalities produced by the labor and effort and energy of others. So the product should be provided as a public good in the nonprofit sector if we see a lot of free riders feeling from their perspective that they are forced to take advantage of these benefits due to their economic situations. So there are many theories and ways to look at the nonprofit sector. And generally, we focus on the discipline-centered explanations like I've been talking about. And I'd really like to spend a little more time on the interdisciplinary nature of the research in the sector. In the historical point of view, the major factors are distrust of government, like I've mentioned, and voluntary associations. But the effect of religion as well is very powerful. There are other driving factors, and those are the three I talked about, but as well, First Amendment rights, population diversity, income tax and tax deductions, shifts in public policy over time. All of these things are discussed in the various theories that motivate, from a historical perspective, the creation of nonprofits and spur voluntary activity. When we talk about social theories, we're really talking about socialization. So therefore, we were talking about the formation of social and human capital. But it's also about reinforcing norms and values. And as we find out from the historical tradition, these norms and values are going to change and modify over time. And so nonprofits, in effect, in some ways, become mediating sort of structures that help us transition from one phase to the next historically. And then on the political side, I've talked a little bit about how it reveals that nonprofits help us accommodate diversity. They allow us to experiment in ways that we can't do in government. They free us up from the slow process of government and from bureaucracy in general, and we can really pay quick response to minority needs. So that's all from the political point of view, from political scientists. And then again, the economic point of view talked about private versus public goods, the things that we do as individuals and as organizations, which are externalities. And the reason that nonprofits often are created are because market and government failures to take care of these issues. And so nonprofits, in effect, can be seen from the economic viewpoint as gap fillers in a transition of some sort. And so we start looking at different theories like supply side and demand side theories. And then there are also the motivational theories that come into play. That's another way to look at why do we have a voluntary sector? Why do people form nonprofits? Well, is it altruism? They just do it because it's the best thing to do and it's selfless. Or is there self-interest involved? Well, we find out from motivational theories that it's both, that there's some self-interest often from people who are social entrepreneurs, and there are those people who are able to pursue a nonprofit and have the means, and they do it for altruistic reasons and so forth. So we see all sorts of blends of these different ideas. No one theory is exclusive to any others. And so understanding nonprofits is complicated. But the biggest thing that can help us along here is that everything is interdisciplinary. Now, we do have a broad-based sort of theory that covers everything in sort of a generalized way called the theory of the commons. And it really says what I've been saying is that no matter how you look at nonprofits, it's best to use the different perspectives as tools to get a greater understanding, and that everything about the nonprofit sector and volunteerism in general is really interdisciplinary. And that's so the theory of commons is really a broad-ranging theory that you could really talk about quite a lot. But for our purposes, that's all we need to know, that it's an interdisciplinary sort of understanding of what motivates people to do nonprofits and so forth. And it assumes that common goods are more or less a separate category from private and public goods. So let me take you to a graphic that sums up a lot of what I've been discussing here. Here are the major factors that I've laid out for you in history, sociology, political science, economics. And it's Lohmann's theory of the commons, really, to put a name on it. But the idea from this is the fact that at least some nonprofits exist to provide common goods to groups of individuals who have an interest or need for them. And so regardless of status or who you are as an individual, these are available to everybody. And so this is a nice review graphic here. Now, there are two dimensions really to talk about nonprofit voluntary action: how we explain it, and then how we justify what's going on in it. Is it really worth the effort? Are we accomplishing anything? So how do we explain it? The two general theories are, is it driven by demand side or supply side theory or not? And so these are simple theories, and I'm not going to delve into them really too deeply, but let's just take a general look at them. Whether something is demand side driven or supply side driven can best be understood as a response to some kind of unmet demands. So is it an important supply function that creates its own demand? Or is it a sort of a push and pull strategy that the older versions of advertising used to use? Now, when we talk about push and pull, ideas and so forth are pushed on you in a broad advertising approach, a shotgun approach, a broad-based message on television really is a push message, because anybody who sees that medium, it's a mass mediated channel, is going to get the message who pays attention to it. The pull side is a different marketing approach where you try and engage someone and get them to respond in some way. So when you see an ad on television that asks you to call an 800 number, that's really trying to create a pull strategy with you. So what I'm saying is that these things apply, these two theories, push and pull, or demand and supply side, apply when we look at what creates the nonprofit sector and all of that. So demand side deals with urgent public problems such as illiteracy, drug addiction, violence, gun violence, and so forth. These are broad-based societal problems. They are demanding a solution, is one way to think about it. And success or failure in this area really depends on how well or how poorly your nonprofit is able to mitigate some of the problems. And remember again that the nonprofit is stepping into an area the government is not taking care of, or the private sector is not able to take care of. There is no profit motive. And then we look at the supply side. It just means that the nonprofit sector, if we look at it from this point of view, it's impelled by the resources and the ideas and the energies and so forth that flow into it from real people who are social entrepreneurs and donors and volunteers and so forth. And so this perspective is just as valid. It holds that it's about people with resources who drive the engine of the voluntary and the nonprofit action that happens. So this is more of an emphasis on the entrepreneurial side of nonprofit activity. And it challenges the older notions, historical notions of what a nonprofit is and so forth. And now let's look at how it's justified. So we try and explain it in terms of supply and demand, but we also try and justify it in terms of value. Is it instrumental value or is it expressive value? Well, instrumental value is something we measure in outcomes and by performance. So nonprofit and voluntary action is also expressive, though. Individuals can express their values through work, volunteer activities, donations, that sort of thing. So expressive values are things that we give, and instrumental values are the things that we can tangibly measure and say we accomplished something. For donors, volunteers, and staff, the value may be entirely psychic within their own mind. So it is somewhat altruistic, and it may arise simply from the act of expressing commitment, caring, belief in the cause, donating that time and effort. The expressive and instrumental dimensions here complement one another, really. They're not exclusive. They don't create tensions. Some nonprofits are going to focus more on measuring the outcomes and performance. Some are going to focus more on the sense that we know that we are changing an attitude or a value or something, which is much harder to value or to measure, excuse me, but we understand the expressive value. We would try and understand our progress in other ways. Well, really, when you think about it, as a founder of a nonprofit or a manager of one, it's your job to bridge those two dimensions, bring them into alignment, and get the best that you can out of the performance of your organization. So here's a nice grid, and it's a way to look at the elements I've been discussing. So here we have 4 quadrants. On the top, we have the demand side orientation or the supply side. And then here on the left-hand side, we can see that reading across, we would have an instrumental rationale and expressive rationale across the bottom. So depending on which quadrant we look at, we can see what the combination of instrumentality, expressiveness, or goes with demand or supply. And we can find out and understand where we fit or where we would like to be. And that might lead us on figuring out how to get there. So say you are doing a service delivery. Well, your instrumental rationale would be something that you want to measure. So you're high in instrumental rationale, and it's a demand side. You're responding to something that you feel is compelling you to do it. You're providing a needed service. You're responding to government and market failure. Now we'll look over here in the grid where it says supply side orientation. Here, the individual, the nonprofit, is based on a social entrepreneurial idea. It's still high, though, in the instrumental rationale. So here, the social entrepreneur is providing a vehicle through that nonprofit for the entrepreneurship that they feel, but to create a social enterprise that combines a commercial goal to satisfy that entrepreneurial need with a charitable goal. And you can measure your progress. And you can see it's the same across the bottom where you look at the expressive rationale in terms of demand side or supply side. An expressive rationale on the demand side would be civic political engagement. So you're mobilizing citizens for politics, you're advocating for a cause, you're building social capital within a community. That is an expressive sort of thing. And why are you doing it? You're responding to the demand that is out there. So it's expressive rationale, so it is both. If we read across the other expressive rationale you could have from the supply side orientation, it would be more in terms of values and faith. So volunteers, staff, donors, they get to express the values that they hold, their commitments, their faith through work, through their accomplishments. They get an outcome that is expressive versus something that is measured as a tangible outcome. There is an outcome, but it's much more difficult to measure. Now here we see some common characteristics that nonprofit organizations have. So let's just go through these quickly. These are just dimensions, elements that we could look at to most organizations in the private sector. They are organized entities, maybe even a little more so than in the private sector, because they are chartered as formal nonprofit organizations through a tax form filed with the IRS, and most are incorporated under state law. So right there is a whole lot of structure and formal organization. They are private. They're not agencies of the government. They might receive some funding from the government, but they are indeed started and maintained by private individuals. They are characterized by nonprofit distribution. So this means any money that is earned above and beyond what is needed to pay the bills cannot be expressed out in dividends to investors, can't be paid as bonuses to the workers or managers, but have to be instead reinvested into the organization. So the nonprofit distribution clause is a very significant characteristic of the nonprofit organization, and it's true of all legal nonprofits. They are also voluntary. There's a board of directors generally, but we almost always, and that is generally volunteer, and we generally have some complement of volunteer labor that has to be handled just like regular labor as far as that goes. They are self-governing. So control does lie with that board of directors, a board of trustees, and they are ultimately responsible for the final fiduciary health and welfare of the nonprofit. And finally, they are for the public benefit. This is a common characteristic of a nonprofit. They exist to serve some social purpose deemed to be of public benefit. Let's talk a little bit about how they share similar characteristics with organizations also in the private sector. They're open systems. In fact, they're organized the same way we organize any organization in the private sector. And these are certainly open systems. Nonprofits are dependent on and interaction internally and externally, frequently within their external environments. They shift away from emphasizing the internal mechanics of an organization's operations quite often and focus as much as they can on their essential mission. Now, they also are resource dependent. Nonprofits are dependent on external constituencies to obtain the revenues they need, the information they need, and other resources. Often they need help with their performance measurement in finding out how well they're doing and so forth. There is some goal displacement. Sometimes a nonprofit will start up, has a certain specific primary goal, but quickly finds that by accumulating additional information and encountering the actual reality of the situation that they have to alter their goals slightly, They have to change their activities to make sure that they're satisfying now some of those people who they're going to rely on to donate money. So goal displacement sometimes happens as a result of revenues that come in, and it's up to the founders of the organization and the owners really to say, do we want to give up this much control and change our goals somewhat? Isomorphism is really that characteristic that we see that nonprofits in the same field tend to become more like each other as a result of facing the similar consequences and challenges and influences. So they all tend to look alike. I think that this is probably, out of all of these things, the one that is the most likely that we would see some parallels in the private sector where, say, look at the fast food industry, they tend to act alike, look alike in so many different ways in their behavior and so forth. There are two types of this isomorphism. The mimetic is the tendency of the organizations, the nonprofits, to mimic each other. So certainly that's what we do in the private sector. Under the rules of contingency management, which we're still using in the nonprofit sector, we would be looking at best practices and seeing what is the competition doing, and can we copy them in any way if they're doing something that makes them better or more efficient or more successful than we are. And then there's also this normative isomorphism. This is where the nonprofit organization is influenced by the same standards of professional practice that all the rest are. And that's the commonalities that all nonprofits share, the no distribution of excess funds and so forth, those sorts of ideas. Okay, and finally, to wrap this up, we talked just a few comments about the internal structure and the organizational culture. There's a lot of research on this, trying to explain why some nonprofit organizations are relatively bureaucratic and centralized, while others are more entrepreneurial and flexible. I would say this is the same conversation that we have in the private sector. Some organizations feel more of a need to take care of those things, respond to the social needs that are out there, to become green or whatever it is. And I think it's pretty much the same thing in the nonprofit sector. We can look at the task environment, for instance, and the internal structure. What are the operations and daily activities, the day-to-day transactions that make up a nonprofit organization's work? It is really very similar to what we see in the private sector. The biggest problem really is that a lot of times for many nonprofits, money, effort goes into providing a service or a product for the public in need, and then nothing comes back. And so you immediately have a one-way cash flow. And it always puts a nonprofit at a disadvantage in that sense. So you do the same things as far as business processes go, but you're on a deficient end of the revenue cycle. And so that is certainly, your task environment is set up differently, and you have to do some different things to overcome this. This really bespeaks to why our nonprofit culture is slightly different or considerably different from private sector cultures. Well, for certainly those nonprofits that are about an idea or a cause, we're going to have a lot of people who are living out their expressive values and so forth. They're not looking for the profit motive. They're looking to see, can we change the world in some way for the better? And so certainly organizational culture, no matter where you are, what type of organization, what sector, what industry, is a reflection of the people in it and their common beliefs and ethics and all of those things. And the nonprofit sector is different. People enter it for different reasons than they do the private sector. So organizational culture will be different, but the group dynamics are going to be the same things that we already understand. The way people interact together, maybe the themes are different, but human interaction and those challenges are all going to be the same. Okay, folks, that's all I want to talk about this time. I'll talk to you again soon.